Hello and welcome to yet another video, and in this video I'll be talking about this lens right here. It's actually one of my favorite L lenses I really owned. It's the 16 to 35mm f4 LIS USM. Now this lens has been out for a little while now, I know, but it's one of my favorite L lenses and I've been using it throughout so many years now. Actually the weather sealing starts to rip apart. Actually this dropped and broke this rubber gaskets right here, and it's still actually going very strong. So in this video I'll be talking about this lens, the pros and cons, from the build quality to image quality to operational side of things, what I think about it. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video. So the Canon 16 to 35mm L f4 IS USM. Now this lens, I bought it a long time ago, actually right when it was came out, so it was still around like 1,000 euros. Nowadays you can find it between 900 to 800 euros, sometimes 799 euros. Well, that's actually around 800 euros on promotion. So it's still a really affordable lens, wide angle lens that's weather sealed, really quick autofocus with really nice build quality. And as I mentioned before, the actual rubber gaskets is peeling off here. Actually, I dropped it quite a few times, not on purpose, of course. So yeah, it's really a testament to how well this lens is built throughout the years that I've been owning it. And as I mentioned earlier, I've been owning it since when it was shortly after it came out, because right after it came out, I just got so I was really amazed by the image quality, the build quality, and everything that I had to get one. I was upgrading from the 17 to 40, which I'm sure a lot of people was really upgrading from that lens because it is a great lens. It is even more compact, but it doesn't have IS, and you know, like 16mm to me makes a huge difference than 17mm. It's hard to explain. Anyway, in this video, I will actually be dividing into like 3 different sections, which is the operational side of things, the build quality, pros and cons, and then into the image quality, and then into my conclusion, what I think about it. And I'm sorry if my audio is bad because I just got back home, and this is just pretty much a rough setup, and I'm actually very distracted right now by a lot of seagulls outside my window. I think I have a pet seagull, but they keep on stealing the food that I keep on feeding to the seagull that I want to feed. Anyway, let's actually talk about this lens. So the usability, the operational side of things, the build quality of this lens, that's the thing I'll be talking about first. The pros and cons, well, I don't really have a lot of cons about it, other than the fact that maybe it could be a bit smaller, and maybe the rubber gaskets here could, you know, be a bit thicker, so that if someone like me that carries a lot of cameras and changes a lot of lenses, drop it several times, the rubber would actually still last. But you know, that's very nitpicking, and that's really, you know, asking too much in my opinion, because it's still a really well built lens. Like the metal mount and everything, if I rub my finger on the metal mount, I don't know if you can see it, it's very dusty. Like, it's kind of gray. So yeah, I definitely travel with this lens through like heat wave, so in a really high temperature places, also through snowstorm, through dust storm, through rain, typhoons, things like that. Been through Southeast Asia with it, Northern Europe, Southern Europe, and many other places with this lens, and it's just proved to be a really well built lens. Unlike many lenses, if I look inside, despite how much dust there are on the front element and the back element, there are actually no dust inside the actual glass element. I actually shined the light through this and there's no dust to be seen, and it's just a really well sealed lens, and it's just a lens that I can be comfortable and confident, even though the rubber gaskets has pretty much been ripped out. I'm still really comfortable about this lens, shooting with this lens, like if I'm traveling through environments that, you know, my equipment has to really endure, which is extreme at some point, because if I'm out there shooting in the field, I'm not really easy in my gear. Anyway, moving up to the next point, which is the the zoom ring and the focus ring. After all these years, it's still actually really smooth. I think about 3 weeks ago I photographed at the beach, and obviously being in the Netherlands, the wind is really strong, so a lot of sand really try to get into here, but you know, after like a few hours of doing this to it, it feels like that all the sand are gone. Well, I believe that all the sand are gone, but I don't know. But you know, there's no resistance, and after all these years, it's still really, really nice, but really smooth. It's such a nice lens to use. Also, I really like the fact that these two rings has different stiffness to it. They're very, 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 very smooth, don't get me wrong. It's just that the focus ring is a bit lighter than the zoom ring, which is something that I like, because obviously if you're doing like manual focusing work, let's say you're shooting in video with some Canon cameras that doesn't have autofocusing system, like dual pixel AF, like the original 1DX, it can be really, really nice and useful when you want to get that really precise manual focus, but also you don't want to introduce a lot of shake to your footage, things like that, especially if you're on handheld. Which the image stabilization, well, the IS works really fine, by the way, then this really, really helps. It's just so smooth. The focus distance is actually not very far, so you can easily focus from its minimum focusing point, which is like 0.28. Yeah, 0.28 centimeters to infinity, like in just like a really, really short distance, and you will definitely feel that confirmation kick in once you reach the end, but you are still able to do full-time manual focus with this lens, and that's actually quite nice. And also with the stiffer focusing, sorry, the zoom ring here, that's a bit stiffer. It's really nice because, well, if you're doing something like long exposure, you don't really want to knock it by accident, but it is still really, really nice and smooth, that you don't really feel any resistance, but it's still resistant enough that you don't accidentally knock it, if that makes sense. Anyway, the switches here are really nice and stiff, but not too stiff like the original 24-70 f2.8L, and it's actually really, really nice to use, especially when you have gloves on. You will still feel that confirmation click and feeling to it, so it's really, really nice. The actual filter thread is also a really, really common filter thread. It's the 77mm filter thread. That's another pro point for me because I don't really have to travel a lot with like different adapter rings or just filter rings in general. If I want to like mount, like, let's say like a Lee filter on it, so something like the 70 to 200mm will still share the same filter thread ring as this one. Well, that also depends. I just smudged the lens. That also depends on the actual type of 70 to 200mm you have, but mine actually fits on this lens, so that's actually quite good for me, as well as my 24-70 f2.8L from Canon, that also uses the 77mm filter thread. And yeah, so it's a really, really versatile lens, and having a lens that has a really common filter size thread, things like that, will also mean that you will be able to get really, really affordable, professional, good quality accessories for the lens, such as the filter holder, filter rings, different types of filters for it. You know, it'll be more accessible, and also if you really need some sort of accessories for it really urgently, it also means that, you know, there's a higher chance that it will be available on like the web store or like the traditional brick and mortar store, your local camera stores, things like that. So it's really, really nice. The autofocusing system on this lens is actually really, really nice and quick. You know, like, I think it's kind of like a myth when you say like, you know, the brighter aperture the lens is, the better autofocusing capability that the camera will have. I kind of like, well, that is kind of true in some ways, especially if you're focusing low light. But, you know, with this particular lens, even though it's f4, it can focus really, really accurately and really, really snappy. Like, it's really fast with this lens and really, really accurate. And if I compare this with my 24-70 f2.8L, and that's an f2.8 by the way, it's just so much more accurate. The camera hunts a lot less, even at f4 versus the f2.8 of the 24-70 f2.8. I really, really love this lens. It's a really, really reliable lens. Not only that the build quality as well, but the autofocusing system really, really helps the camera to focus really, really well on the subject, even though it's only an f4. The only downside, which I forgot to mention, well, I just remembered it now pretty much, is the sound of the IS. If you're recording internally on, like with the onboard mic, you might be able to catch the sound of the IS. And yeah, but if you're recording sound externally or just with an external microphone, you will definitely not really hear it. But of course, if you're on a tripod, then you can just turn it off and the IS will just be turned off. But you know, it will only happen if you're like indoors, let's say filming something like a museum where you will hear even the sound of whispers. So yeah, but if you're outdoors, you don't need to worry about the actual sound of the image stabilization kicks in when you're recording video, unlike the 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 where the IS is actually loud enough for the internal board to really catch the sound even if you're recording outdoors. But when it comes to, you know, recording outdoors with this lens, you don't really need to worry about the sound of the IS kicking in because it's not that loud. It's loud enough that indoors you hear it, but outdoors you don't. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, and if you really want this, you know, lens to be fully weather sealed, you probably will need to add some sort of protective filter in front of it. And that will actually make it completely weather sealed because this is an internal zoom ring. So water, driplets, dust still can get inside here, although this lens is well built enough. But just if you're going by the instruction manual, it's still recommended that you should put some sort of protective filter that's thinner than about 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters thin filter. If you put in any thicker filters in front of it, there might be some vignetting because this is an ultra wide angle lens. So now actually let's talk about the image quality. So the image quality also, I really don't have that much bad things to say about this lens. Now, I only have up to the EOS R 30 megapixel camera to really use this lens with. So I'm not sure how this lens would compare to if you would use something like the R5 or the 5D SR, 5DS line of cameras where, you know, you're hitting 45, 50 megapixels. So I can only confirm for 30 megapixels, if that means anything. And for those cameras under 30 megapixels, I think that the image quality, at least to how I use it, is really nice. The contrast control, the sharpness control for zoom ring is great. The color fringing, the chromatic aberration, things like that, well, they're kind of the same thing, is also really, really nice controlled. It's still present, but not as often as, let's say, the f2.8 version of this lens, or it's not as pronounced as, let's say, even the 17 to 40. The 17 to 40 is also really well controlled, but this is just like a whole new level well controlled. So it's really nice. And when it does show up, it's kind of natural, like you can ignore it, or you can just spend like a few seconds or literally just 1 second in Lightroom and just get rid of it with the correction. So it's really that good. And if you really like on a go, if you're a travel photographer or a photographer that needs to deliver the image right after the shoot, or let's say an event photographer or something like that, then, you know, this lens is good enough that you can actually rely on the optics. So you don't need to do a lot of corrections to it. It's just sharp enough. It's not too sharp. It's just at a really sweet point for me, especially if you're shooting portraits as well, because I do sometimes shoot portrait with an ultra wide angle lens as well. You can get really nice creative results using the ultra wide, even at f4. If you use it on full frame, it will give you a really, really nice background blur still. Obviously, you will need to play with that distance. And if you put this lens on the crop frame camera, yes, the crop frame cameras will actually magnify into the glass and kind of maximize the resolution a little bit, stretching it a little bit. It will still look really, really sharp, and it really says a lot about the designing and the engineering of this lens that it will still look great on even a crop frame camera. Like, you can look at the results. Actually, you can put this lens on both full frame and crop frame cameras and will be really, really happy with the actual results getting from both sensor size cameras. The one downside about this lens is probably the actual distortion. Now, ultra-wide angle lenses do generally have distortions, that's normal. But on this lens, if you're shooting something like architectural photography, I feel like, you know, if your work is especially more into the fine art direction, then you might not really be so happy with this lens, and you will probably be spending a bit of time actually correcting a lot of the flaw of the distortions of this lens. It's kind of bad in my opinion. But if you're not doing something fine art and just doing a normal architectural photography where you just want everything to be in there and it's just for like some sort of listing, things like that, then, you know, it's still more than good enough because you're not really focusing on the actual artistic concept of it, but if you're really focusing on the mood, artistic concept, and into also a fine art kind of architecture, photography, things like that, using this lens, then the distortion is more annoying than helpful. So pick a side if you're an architecture photographer or interior photographer, things like that. So yeah, otherwise, one last point would actually be the lens flare and the sun starburst effect. I don't know the proper name for it, but let me first start with the lens flare. I really love the lens flare of this lens. Yes, it does actually have a lens hood, but I've used it so much that I don't know where the lens hood is right now, so I cannot really give you the size comparison with the actual lens hood. But anyway, it does have a lens hood to prevent lens flare, of course, but if you do want lens flare, the lens flare on this particular lens will actually deliver really, really nice and natural result. I really love the lens flare look coming from this lens when I do want it. And when you do want that sun starburst effect, like if you're using like between f11 to f14, f16, you will get a really, really nice sun starburst effect, and I really love it. A lot of photographers I know don't care about it, but to me, it's just a little detail that I really like. So for example, the 17 to 14 millimeter lens, it does have a really, really nice sun starburst effect, but this is much, much nicer in my opinion. But this is also very, very, very subjective to different photographers. I like it, it's pronounced, it's nice, it makes its own statement. So it's really, really, really good. So one last point about this lens is, well, it's more kind of negative to a lot of people, and to me, I don't really mind. It's actually the vignetting. So the vignetting of this lens is actually controllable, let's say. So for me, it's definitely pronounced, like it's there, but is it distracting? It's not really distracting for me. It's like, it helps to actually focus into the subject a lot of times for me. And even if I do lens correction in post with Lightroom, I usually add back a lot of vignetting anyway, at least to my aesthetics. When I shoot pictures, I really love the vignetting in lenses, so that's why I don't really mind it too much with this lens. But if your work does require like shooting a lot of bricks, shooting a lot of walls, shooting a lot of I don't know, portraits against the white wall or something, you will see a lot of vignetting for sure. And, you know, if you're shooting JPEG, that might not be such a big problem because there is an internal camera correction for that. But, well, depending on the model, of course, but usually modern cameras, at least in the past 8 or 9 years from Canon cameras, there is some sort of correction in that for that on board. But if you're shooting RAW, then you know you will have to do a lot of correction, a lot of fixing for that, which again will take a few seconds. So yeah. Oh, and one last point is actually the sharpness. I find that this lens at f4 is pretty sharp still, but not at its sharpest point. If you stop it down to like 5.6, it's getting really, really sharp. I love using it between f8 and f14. I feel like those are the sweet spot, like throughout from center to corner. And after f16, it gets a little bit soft, but still sharp enough if you were to like only print up to A3, A2 sizes of images, or just put on social media, things like that. It's still really, really sharp. And if you're only using it for like personal work, then I think even using f19 or f18 would still be good enough. But you know, for anything professional, you might not really want to use higher than f14. So yeah, and now into pretty much my conclusion about this lens. So I highly recommend this lens, no doubt. I'm really, really, really happy I bought it. I was really reluctant about like upgrading between the from the 17 to 40 to this lens, simply because this lens is bigger. But also, like, since I upgraded, I never really looked back, because yes, it's bigger, but you know, like, it comes with so much performance. It has IS. The IS on here also never fails. Like, if you're a 70-200 or the 24-105 millimeter lens user with the IS, of course, you will know how annoying the IS on those lenses are. Like, if you are a person like me who's on the field a lot and doesn't really care about the equipment, and you know, the IS on those lenses breaks way too easily, and on this lens, it survived a lot of drops. It survived a lot of, you know, banging here and there. It just survived me. So that's really a testament. So the IS is good. The build quality is great. The weather sealing, even though the rubber gaskets are like ripping apart and some parts are already ripped, it's great. This lens has been with me to so many places throughout the past few years, and it never really let me down. It always focused accurately. Of course, I think there are like the past few years, I think there was only 3% of the time or 2% of the time that it didn't focus, but that is usually my fault, such as for not clearing the water in front of the lens when I'm shooting in heavy rain or something, or shooting it underwater where it's obviously very, very hard for a lot of cameras to focus. But anyway, back to about the lens. The image quality is really, really sharp. A lot of its flaws are really, really nice characteristics to the lens. But if you don't like them, you can definitely correct them within like a matter of seconds, unless if you are in like fine art architecture or fine art interior photographer, where you may have to spend a bit more manual correction on this lens. But you know, for the price, it's great. And when it's, you know, coming to like Canon cashback time and promotional time, things like that, this lens is pretty much on the same price level as the 17 to 40 millimeter lens. I'm aware that depending on different part of the world, it might be more expensive or cheaper, but generally for the performance, for the price, for the size, for everything you pay, this lens, oh man, it's such a great lens to use, really. I never regretted it. It's one of my most well-invested equipment, especially for how much crap I pretty much give it, like dropping here and there and so on. But yeah, it's a really, really nice lens to use. Can't say bad things about it. Oh, and one last thing, because this is, you know, an older generation lens, if you compare to the RF system, obviously the RF system is completely different, but if you're comparing it to it, then this lens is still usable in video work. If you are coming from the RF system and looking at this lens, the RF is definitely way, way, way more superior. But if you're just looking from the EF system on its own to shoot video for focusing system work and everything, this lens is still really, really reliable. It's brilliant. It will never fail on autofocusing anything. So yeah, that's it for this video. If you need a free photography guidebook, it's linked down in the description below. If you have any questions, suggestions, recommendations, anything, feel free to leave those suggestions, questions, recommendations, what have you, down in the description below. Feel free to share your story as well. If you have this lens or if you're looking to get this lens, what are your thoughts and, you know, what are your experience, your stories, what have you. So yeah, feel free to just leave it down below. And with my free photography guidebook, it's also free on my website. The link is down in the description below. You don't need to submit your email address, nothing. I will not send you or bombard you with any newsletter nonsense. So yeah, just click and download. Thank you very, very much for watching. Stay safe, have fun shooting. Bye for now.